This is BBC World News America. Reporting from Washington, I'm Laura Trevelyan.
We're finished here. Let's go. Make your way out. We're finished. Let's go.
Thank you very much.
Another day of confusion and clarification over where President Trump stands on the threat from Russia. But according to him, no one's ever been so strong.
There's been no president ever as tough as I have been on Russia. All you have to do is look at the numbers, look at what we've done.
Nothing short of a miracle. The 12 Thai boys and their coach speak for the first time about their dramatic rescue. Plus, humorous art through the ages. How a new exhibit sheds light on what's funny down the centuries and why. Welcome to World News America. It's day 2 of White House damage control following the president's press conference with Vladimir Putin in Helsinki. Now, the White House press secretary, Sarah Sanders, says Mr. Trump did not mean to say no when asked whether Russia was still targeting the US. Rather, he was refusing to take more questions. But that wasn't the impression of the press pool, leading to more headlines and yet more confusion. Here was Sanders' defense.
We certainly believe that we are taking steps to make sure they can't do it again, unlike previous administrations. This president is actually taking bold action and reform to make sure it doesn't happen again. But he does believe that they would target certainly U.S. elections again.
And when it comes to being tough on Russia, President Trump says it's him that sets the standard.
There's been no president ever as tough as I have been on Russia. All you have to do is look at the numbers, look at what we've done, look at sanctions, look at ambassadors not there, look, unfortunately, at what happened in Syria recently. And I think President Putin knows that better than anybody, certainly a lot better than the media. He understands it, and he's not happy about it. And he shouldn't be happy about it, because there's never been a president as tough on Russia as I have been. Okay, thank you.
Well, for more on this, I'm joined now by our North America reporter, Anthony Zerka. So, Anthony, when all is said and done after today, does the president believe the judgment of his intelligence agencies that Russia continues to target the United States?
Well, that's certainly what the White House and Sarah Huckabee Sanders are saying. But here we are the day after, and things were following a pattern where Donald Trump says something controversial, the White House walks it back, and then the next day Donald Trump says something about how he really meant or something controversial again, except this time the White House is having to walk it back again. So there's a line from the White House, and then we'll see what Donald Trump says tomorrow.
But could all of this have been avoided if President Trump, when he was there in Helsinki next to Vladimir Putin, had just said, yes, I accept the judgment of my intelligence agencies that Russia did meddle in the election?
That would have been the easy way to avoid this, and usually that's why people are so careful in these diplomatic situations with their language. In fact, this whole thing could have been avoided. Donald Trump didn't have to meet with Vladimir Putin. He didn't have to go to Helsinki. In fact, some of his advisors, John Kelly, as chief of staff for one, were saying, this is not a very good idea to people. But here he is. He decided to do it. He decided to take those 2 hours behind closed doors just with Vladimir Putin and then have that press conference that created a firestorm.
And Anthony, the president continues to obsess about the Russia probe. He calls it a witch hunt, but he just can't get out from under it, can he?
No, it's going to go on. And obviously the Mueller investigation is part of that driving this narrative. We had indictments last week. We have the Justice Department indicting another alleged Russian operative earlier this week. But time will heal some of the wounds. You saw some of the effect of Donald Trump's statement yesterday. Bob Corker, a Republican senator who said the dam had broken yesterday, today was saying Donald Trump's making a first step in the right direction. And I think if you look at the polls, generally the opinions of Russia divide on a very partisan line. There are Republicans think Donald Trump is doing the right thing. Democrats think he's doing the wrong thing. It's going to return to that norm. It takes something remarkable to break out of that partisan divide in this country.
But Anthony, the economy is good heading into the midterm elections in November. The president doesn't need this, does he?
No, he doesn't. It's a big distraction. It's 2 days when he could have been talking about the economy. He tried tweeting about the economy earlier today, but it's off message. And what Donald Trump wants to do, he wants to try to rally the base. That's why he's talking about immigration. That's why he's talking about the media. He also wants to talk about jobs and the economy because it's a good track record right now. Democrats, honestly, they would probably do better talking about health care and issues that would get their voters out. But they're perfectly happy to watch Donald Trump put out fires and the White House put out fires. There's still another 3 or 4 months till the election, so there's time to go.
Anthony Zerka, thanks so much for joining us. And for more on how this is playing on Capitol Hill, my colleague Katty Kay spoke to Democratic Senator Ben Cardin, who sits on the Foreign Relations Committee.
Senator Cardin, President Trump has now said that he misspoke at the summit with President Putin and that he does have full confidence in the American intelligence community. Do you believe the president?
The president with Mr. Putin at that summit in Helsinki, he made Mr. Putin's day. He did not dispute Mr. Putin's account. He made it clear that the Russian probe in the United States is a witch hunt and therefore discredited our own investigations in our country. He sided with Mr. Putin's accounts of what was happening. He did not use that opportunity to speak out about Mr. Putin's aggressive behavior in Ukraine and Europe and the U.S. elections. Mr. Trump jeopardized the U.S. Foreign policy and national security and U.S. leadership. It was a dark moment for the United States.
You're the ranking member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Of course, you see a lot of information about the state of Russian relations and activities around the world. Would you agree with President Trump's characterization that during the course of 4 hours, he managed to take the American-Russian relationship to the worst it's ever been to something much better?
We certainly want a relationship with Russia, but we want it on our terms, not Mr. Putin's terms. We've got to be very clear that Russia is an adversary. They have violated the sovereignty of states, including Ukraine recently, but also going back to Georgia and Moldova. They've attacked our freest election systems, not just in the United States, but also in Europe. We've got to be clear that what Mr. Putin is doing in Russia is against our national security interests. They're an adversary. And yes, we want to have a relationship. We want that relationship based upon honesty and trust, not based upon Mr. Putin's terms.
You're clearly not happy with the way that President Trump is handling this, but what can Democrats actually do about it? You're pretty powerless to change the actions of the president, aren't you? And the words of the president, indeed.
Well, the Congress is an independent branch of government. I expect my colleagues on both sides of the aisle not only to speak out, but take action to make it clear to Americans.
But Senator, it doesn't look like Republicans are prepared to do that.
Well, I must tell you, I've talked to a lot of Republicans. I think they're going to be challenged to stay silent here. America demands action. The global community expects the U.S. to lead the free world. And what happened this week with Mr. Putin and Mr. Trump needs to be repudiated.
You say that Americans demand action, but there is a new Reuters poll that's just come out saying that only 32% of Republican voters actually side with the U.S. intelligence community's assessment that Russia meddled in the 2016 election. What do you make of that?
The facts are the facts. There is no disagreement that Russia interfered at Mr. Putin's direction in the U.S. election, and they wanted to favor Mr. Trump. That's a fact. That's no longer subject to any dispute. The only person in leadership in the United States that raises questions about that is Mr. Trump. His intelligence team, his closest advisors all understand that it was Russia that interfered in our election, and they were trying to do it to help Mr. Trump.
Senator Cardin, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Their story of survival captured the world's imagination, and now the 12 Thai boys and their coach have been speaking for the very first time about their cave rescue. At a news conference, the boys spoke about their ordeal, calling it a moment of miracle when the rescuers found them. Our correspondent Jonathan Head was at the news conference and has this report.
Dom spent his 13th birthday in the cave, at the time unsure if he'd ever get out. But you'd hardly know it as he thanked the doctors and nurses on leaving hospital today, the very picture of health. This was him 2 weeks ago, smiling for his rescuers, when the 12 boys and their coach were discovered after 9 days without food. He and his teammates made their first public appearance since their astonishing rescue, treating journalists to some nifty footwork before taking the stage to recount their experiences in the cave. They'd gone to explore, just for an hour, they said, but found themselves cut off by fast-rising water. 14-year-old Adun, who speaks the best English among them, then described the moment when, after 9 days, they heard the 2 British divers close by.
We were digging and we heard somebody talking, but we didn't think that it was real, so we stopped and listened. But as it turned out, it happened. It was real. I was shocked. I thought there were Thai officers, but when they got out of the water, I found that they were English. I didn't know what to say to them, so I just say hello. It was a miracle. It was a miracle. I was shocked.
For all of them, the hardest thing in the cave was the hunger. This is the youngest, Titan, who's 11 years old.
I try not to think about food, but because thinking about food, I try not to think about fried rice.
They finished with a tribute to Saman Gunan, the Thai diver who died while trying to save them. Watching at home was Dom's family. His stepfather, Banpot, hadn't been able to see him in hospital. With just a few hours before he came home, it was hard keeping his emotions back. I'm just waiting to welcome him as soon as he gets here, he said. We'll all be there. I just want to hug him.
Well, it's been a very long wait this evening for Dom's family, but we think just a few more minutes to go before he comes home, and for this very ordinary family, hopefully an end to a very extraordinary story.
And then he was there, the boy who'd missed his 13th birthday, but with his miraculous escape had been given a second chance. It's not often you get an ending as happy as this. Jonathan Head, BBC News, Mae Sai, Northern Thailand.
The great escape there. Now, European financial authorities have fined Google a record $5 billion over the use of its Android operating system. The European Commission says the company illegally used the technology to cement its dominant position in searches. Google has denied any wrongdoing and plans to appeal the ruling. Our technology correspondent, Rory Cellan-Jones, has the latest.
If you believe in innovation from everyone, then welcome to Android.
It sees itself as a benevolent giant that just wants to help us communicate. The EU has a different view.
Google has engaged in illegal practices to cement its dominant market position in Internet search.
Google's Android operating system runs on 3/4 of Europe's mobile phones. It's free for phone makers, but the EU says that Google applies conditions which promote its own interests at the expense of rivals. There are 3 complaints: that phone makers must pre-install Google Search and Chrome if they want to use the App Store, they're paid to promote Google Search by installing it and not other search engines, and that they're effectively banned from creating alternative versions of Android.
As a matter of principle, we could ourselves look up another search engine, but only 1% of us who has an Android phone say, oh, I do something else. 99%. If the search app is on your phone, this is what you use.
The fact that Google has so much control over what happens on so many phones not only gives it a lot of power, it gives it a lot of money because it collects vast amounts of data which enables it to target advertising. But the company says that ends up with a great deal for phone users. Google must now pay a record fine and change its ways within 90 days if it's not to face bigger penalties. But it's appealing against the ruling. A spokesperson said Android has created more choice for everyone, not less. A vibrant ecosystem, rapid innovation and lower prices are classic hallmarks of robust competition. With the US and Europe already locking horns over trade, the Google ruling provides another source of conflict.
I don't think trade negotiations are going to be helped by this measure. The biggest losers, however, are going to be European users of smartphones and consumers, because Google has already hinted at the prospect of changing its practices, maybe charging for some services that it didn't charge for before.
Google and other American tech giants insist they're good for consumers, but the EU is determined to curb what it sees as their abuse of their dominance. Rory Cellan-Jones, BBC News.
Boris Johnson, who resigned as Britain's Foreign Secretary in protest over the Brexit plan, has given a highly critical resignation speech in Parliament. He accused Prime Minister Theresa May of dithering over Brexit, claiming her plan for leaving the EU would lead to Britain being in miserable, permanent limbo. Mr Johnson declared it was not too late to save Brexit. With the latest from Westminster, here's our political editor, Laura Kunsberg.
Even the light bulbs at the grandest of houses need changing. The resident here is changing soon too.
What's your Brexit plan, Mr Johnson?
Boris Johnson is on his way out. But today was the time to explain himself. Why one of those who sold Brexit so hard to the public thinks the Prime Minister's plan sells us out. Mr Johnson, ever conscious of reputation, used an unusual resignation speech to say why.
Personal statement, Mr Boris Johnson.
After decades in which UK ministers have gone to Brussels and expostulated against costly EU regulation, we are now claiming that we must accept every jot and tittle. We continue to make the fatal mistake of underestimating the intelligence of the public.
Ouch. He says the government's telling you one thing and doing another. A convinced small band of Brexiteers surrounded him today, but some former Remainers stayed away.
It is not too late to save Brexit. We have time in these negotiations. We have changed tack once, and we can change again. The problem is not that we failed to make the case for a free trade agreement. We haven't even tried.
Almost too strangely to be true, he was speaking while she was speaking, sticking to her lines.
If you have looked at the white paper and the agreement that we came to in Chequers, you will see that the proposal we're putting forward is that we're no longer a member of the customs union, we're no longer a member of the single market.
Many MPs dismiss Boris Johnson now, believing his credibility is shot. But he gives a bellowing voice to widespread concern that Theresa May's Brexit with caveats isn't really Brexit at all. It was a serious warning to the Prime Minister, change tack or there could be much more trouble. It was a very unusual encounter with Boris Johnson, one where he didn't make any jokes. Laura Kunsberg, BBC News in the House of Commons.
The Brexit path in Britain is still unclear. You're watching BBC World News America. Still to come on tonight's programme. Remembering Nelson Mandela 100 years after his birth. We look at why the South African leader's legacy is more complicated than you might think. At least 3 people have died after a building under construction collapsed onto a residential complex near Delhi. It's feared that more people might still be trapped under the rubble, as construction workers were known to be living on site. Salman Ravi sent us this report from the scene itself.
It has been a long wait for the relatives of those believed to have been trapped beneath the debris of the 2 construction buildings. This incident, according to the local people and the local administration, could have been as a result of poor construction material being used by the builders to construct buildings in Greater Noida area around Delhi. So far, the police has arrested 3 people. That includes the builder and the owner of that land. The rescue operations are still on, but the locals believe that the people, the police, they are running out of the time because it has been several hours now that the people are trapped and they have to rescue them soon. Salman Ravi, BBC News, Greater Noida.
Former US President Barack Obama has been urging more women to get into politics to counter the strong men of the world. Speaking in South Africa to young leaders, Mr. Obama cited the negative actions of men around the world and urged African women to get involved.
Men have been getting on my nerves lately. I mean, I just, every day I read the newspaper and I just think, like, brothers, what's wrong with you guys? I mean, what's wrong with us? All right, I mean, we're violent, we're bullying, you know, just not handling our business. So I think empowering more women on the continent, that ought to, right away is going to lead to some better policies. So.
Mr. Obama was speaking at one of many events to mark 100 years since Nelson Mandela's birth. His letters from prison have been published, and there's even a new currency to honour him. But the legacy of the freedom fighter turned icon is complex in South Africa, as Nomsa Maseko now reports.
There are many people who feel that it is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and non-violence.
From the call for armed struggle to the voice of reconciliation, Nelson Mandela took many journeys in his life. The global icon would have been celebrating his 100th birthday today. World-renowned photographer Oscar Gutierrez documented South Africa's transition into democracy and followed Mandela closely through his lens.
I won't be surprised that one day the Catholic Church will say he was one of us. He was an angel. Somehow things take time, but I won't be surprised 100, 200 years from now, or maybe early, they will say he was an angel.
But not everyone feels this way. Young activist Yolanda Janji says Nelson Mandela and his generation should be left in the past.
We still have Nelson Mandela shoved down our throats, literally, as the only stalwart or only struggle icon that contributed to, the freedom that we supposedly have. I'm not going to worship Nelson Mandela. He did what he did. Thanks, but he wasn't the only person.
Researcher and author Sam Fenter, who recently released a compilation of letters Nelson Mandela wrote while imprisoned, feels the criticism is unwarranted.
I think it's very unfair on Madiba and his generation, because they did what they could do and what they had to do, and their job was to bring about democracy. And I think what Madiba's legacy is now is saying to the whole world, if you want anything to work, focus on human rights, equality. We can't separate human beings. We can't bring about more violence. The only way the world is going to survive is if we follow these kind of values.
But in a country struggling with unemployment, discontent, and the ever-increasing inequality gap, Nelson Mandela's ideals will continue to be re-examined.
We're so fixated on the past. The past is ruined. The past it's ruining us presently. But we can just take the lessons and move forward. And taking those lessons means leaving behind Nelson Mandela.
Nomsa Maseko, BBC News, Johannesburg.
Debating Nelson Mandela's legacy there. Now, if you're in need of a good old giggle, and frankly, aren't we all right now, the National Gallery of Art here in Washington has just the thing. A new exhibit called Sense of Humour looks at several centuries worth of drawings and prints that have made us laugh. From the funny to the ridiculous, there's something to make you snicker, as Jane O'Brien has been finding out.
There are many different types of humour, and not everybody will find the same thing funny, especially when the joke's a few hundred years old.
This is an early 18th century French engraving of a skeleton.
Okay, you've got me. Why is that funny?
Look at the angle of the hip. He's practically jaunty. And then, if you haven't noticed those, he appears to be smiling. He is looking at, and to an extent, mocking us.
So I suppose we would have to be able to laugh at ourselves in order to see the humour in this.
Absolutely.
Or what about the French minister who turned into a beast-like cannon and whose fuse was lit by the king? Yeah, perhaps you needed to be around in 1834 to get that one. But political satire is a recurring theme of this exhibition, from the Renaissance to the 20th century. It seems skewering the establishment always raises a smile. Honoré Daumier's 19th century Chamber of Deputies is a case in point.
Nobody is working. People are falling asleep. This guy's blowing his giant nose. Here's another guy who's fallen asleep. Some of them are chit-chatting, giggling with each other. You expect them to be passing notes practically, but nobody's focused on the matter at hand.
What also unites these drawings and prints is the quality. They may be funny or not, but they are all works of art with some familiar names. Here you'll find a smiling Rembrandt, caricature by British satirist James Gillray, Roy Lichtenstein's take on The Scream, and a rather nauseous-looking President Nixon, courtesy of Andy Warhol. Some jokes are more obvious than others. Take this poster on the advantages of being a woman artist.
Okay, so I love this one, actually, not having to undergo the embarrassment of being called a genius.
Because we all worry about that.
Exactly.
Okay, it's funny, I understand that, but why is this important compared to all the other pieces you have here?
One of the things that's very important about this work for me are the artists themselves, the Guerrilla Girls. They were enormously influential, beginning in the 1980s. They are completely anonymous, but they are so important in the history of art that I felt this was something we had to have in the collection.
It's also worth noting that some of the most prolific periods of humorous art occurred during times of social upheaval. There are moments when we all need a good laugh. Jane O'Brien, BBC News, Washington.
Why satire, it seems, never ever goes out of style. I'm Laura Trevelyan. Thank you so much for watching BBC World News America.